When we talk about a country's success, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For most of us, it's money, right? We look at things like GDP or the average income. But what if what if it's only part of the picture? What if those big numbers are actually hiding the real story? So today, we're going to dig a little deeper. We're going beyond the bottom line to ask a really big question. What does development really mean?
Okay, let's kick things off with a little thought experiment. So take a look at these two countries, country A and country B. On paper, they look pretty much identical. I mean, if you run the numbers, the average income in both places is exactly $10,000. So case closed, right? They're equally developed. Well, maybe not. Let's look a little closer.
All right, so here's the question for you. If you had to live in one of these countries, but you had no idea which person you'd end up being, where would you put your money? I mean, in country A, it's a pretty safe bet. You're almost guaranteed a decent middle-class life. But in country B, whoa, you've got a 4 out of 5 shot at living in serious poverty, while just one person is living in absolute luxury. All of a sudden, that average income figure doesn't seem so useful, does it? It kind of misses the whole point.
And that right there, that little experiment, it perfectly illustrates what we can call the money myth. See, for a long time, the go-to metric for a country's progress was super simple: per capita income. The thinking was more money equals more development. End of story. But as we just saw, that one number can hide a massive amount of inequality.
Okay, let's move this from theory to the real world with an example from India. So what you're seeing here is a comparison of 3 states based purely on per capita income. And if you just glance at it, the conclusion seems pretty obvious, right? Haryana's at the top with the highest average income, so it must be the most developed. And Bihar's at the bottom seems simple enough.
But is it really that simple? Think about it like this. Per capita income tells you the average size of a slice of the economic pie. It doesn't tell you if one person is getting a giant slice and everyone else is just getting the crumbs. And maybe even more importantly, that number tells you absolutely nothing else about what life is actually like there.
And this is where things start to get really interesting. Because as soon as you start looking past just the money, you find out that richer doesn't always mean better. The whole picture of what development means, well, it starts to get a lot more complicated.
Okay, so now let's add another piece to the puzzle. We're looking at the infant mortality rate. This is a really powerful indicator of the overall public health system. And just look at that difference. Kerala, the state with the lower average income, remember, has an infant mortality rate of just 7 per 1,000 births. That is more than 4 times better than the supposedly richer state of Haryana. That is a huge reversal, and it's no accident. See, Kerala has historically made very different choices, investing a lot more in public health and education for everybody.
So here's the big takeaway from that. Money is obviously important, nobody's denying that, but it's not the only thing. This data clearly shows that just because a place is richer, it doesn't automatically mean its people are healthier. And that brings up a really fascinating question. Maybe what matters most isn't just how much money a society has, but what it decides to do with that money.
And that idea, the idea of collective spending, of what we do together, that brings us to our next big point: development that's actually for the people. Because it turns out there are some really essential things for a good life that you just can't buy, no matter how much money you have in your own pocket.
I think this quote just nails it. You could be a billionaire, but you can't go out and buy your own personal pollution-free bubble of air to live in. You can't, on your own, create a system that guarantees the medicine you buy at the pharmacy is safe and unadulterated. These are what we call public goods. They're things we all benefit from, but that we can really only achieve if we work together as a community.
I mean, just think about it for a second. Things like community security, clean water, good public schools, reliable hospitals. These aren't just nice-to-haves. They are the absolute bedrock of a truly developed society. And you can see from this list, these are all things we have to build and maintain together.
So, okay, we've talked about what makes life good for us, right here, right now. But what about the folks who come after us? What about tomorrow? And that brings us to maybe the biggest collective challenge we face: the planet's price tag. What's the hidden cost of all this economic growth?
You know, a picture like this really says more than I ever could. For decades, the idea of development pretty much meant using up natural resources as fast as possible without really thinking about the long-term consequences. And that kind of unchecked growth, it's not just harmful, it's completely unsustainable.
And listen, this isn't just about trees and forests. Let's take a look at the very thing that powers our modern world: crude oil. The data here is pretty stark. At our current rate of consumption, all the known reserves of crude oil on the planet could be gone in about 50 years. This isn't some distant problem for our great-grandchildren. This is happening in our lifetime. It's a problem for us. And it really forces you to ask a tough question. Is our whole idea of development built on a foundation that's just about to crumble?
This quote from Lester Brown just completely flips the script on how we should be thinking about all this. The world isn't something we inherited to do with as we please. It's something we've borrowed from our kids. And that idea, the idea of sustainability, it absolutely has to be at the very core of any real, modern definition of development.
Okay, so if we agree that income alone is a flawed way to measure success, and we know we need to include things like health and education and the future of the planet, how in the world do we actually do that? How do you create a better scorecard? What's the real score?
Well, one of the best answers we have so far is something called the Human Development Index, or HDI. It's a really smart attempt to solve this exact problem we've been wrestling with. It doesn't ignore income completely, that's still part of it, but it balances that with two other absolutely crucial things: health, which it measures by life expectancy, and knowledge, measured by years of schooling. What you get is a much richer, much more complete picture of what life is really like for the average person in a country.
So let's see what this looks like in practice. How does the HDI change the story? Take a look at this comparison of India and some of its neighbors. Now, pay attention to Sri Lanka here. Yes, their income per person is higher than India's, but what's really amazing is their life expectancy, a whole 7 years longer on average. And that combination shoots their HDI rank way up. It just proves the point perfectly. Money is an important chapter for sure, but the story of development is just as much about health and education.
So, as we start to pull all this together, I think the main takeaway is this. We've got to move past this simplistic idea that development just equals money. True development, the kind that lasts, is a really delicate balancing act. It's about creating economic growth, absolutely, but doing it in a way that also lifts up everyone's well-being, their health, their education, and protects the planet for the people who are coming next.
Which leaves us with a final big question to think about. The Human Development Index is a huge step in the right direction, but you have to wonder, is it enough? If you were in charge, if you had to design the ultimate way to measure a nation's success, what would you put in it? What, to you, does a truly successful, flourishing society actually look like? Thanks for joining us.